All right, so this is going to be the last hour, as I said, on the Magisterium of the Church. So we'll continue with the article of Monsignor Fenton. After that, we'll see this other article, and that will we'll do as much as we can in 1 hour. And if there is anything left, you can read it on your own because you will have enough on that subject. It's the same again, basically, but it's just to show you, and hopefully at the end you really get it, to show you the discussion on the question. So, okay, we just left saying that the church can teach infallibly in questions of the philosophical order, in dogmatic facts, canonization of saints, and so forth and so on. So the secondary object, and that is at least theologically certain. Now, let's move on. Next paragraph. In order to appreciate the doctrinal authority of the encyclical letters, we must take cognizance of the fact that there is nothing whatsoever in the Vatican Council's definition of papal infallibility which could legitimately give rise to the opinion that the entire content of teachings proposed in the encyclicals can be dismissed simply as non-infallible doctrine. So, there is no basis for that. It would appear, on the other hand, that especially when a number of these documents deal with a certain individual subject, and when the more recent letters repeat and emphasize teachings which have been stressed in previous encyclicals, that some, at least, of the doctrine thus presented to the Church Universal should be considered as taught infallibly by the Church's Ordinary and Universal Magisterium. In fact, it is what happens, actually. That would be like an indirect argument, but basically, even if you claim that the encyclicals are not infallible, the fact is they are sent in the entire church. And when the bishops teach that in their diocese, everybody is teaching that, and then it becomes part of the faith. And the bishop would just say, okay, the faith teaches this. They're not going to say, well, this, you can choose or whatever. They are just going to teach it. And for the essential, at least, content of the encyclicals, it's going to be taught as belonging to the faith, right? They're not going to make and they're right in that, because again, it always will contain the deposit of faith anyway. So they are right in that, but that's the way it works. So it's a good argument. You could use that also for Vatican II, in the sense that if you say, oh, it's only a pastoral council, blah, 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 it's not binding, and so forth and so on, you're wrong. But you could also make the indirect argument against that, saying, well, but the bishops imposed it everywhere to such an extent that you cannot basically survive in a Catholic Babel. That's why, the very existence of the SSPX is a proof of it. If they could, then they would be in the diocese, they would be, somewhere, but they can't, because you would have to sign that you agree with Vatican II and this and that and new mass and so forth. And especially today, it's very clear, like you cannot even have the traditional baptism anymore. So you cannot remain in the Novus Ordo institution and leave a Catholic faith. So it's indirectly a proof that you have a problem there, that it cannot be the authority of Christ. All right. It would appear, on the other hand, that especially when a number... sorry, I have read that at least. Okay. Thus, it would seem that some teachings whose main claim to acceptance on the part of Catholics is to be found in the fact that they are stated in papal encyclicals would actually demand an assent higher than that which must be accorded to the content of the Church's authentic but non-infallible magisterium. Such truths would demand the kind of assent usually designated in theology under the title of Fides Ecclesiastica. Well, we saw what to think about that, so anyway. I'm surprised that he speaks about that now, but maybe it's... I forgot the date. Maybe that was before he made the... No, it's pretty recent. I forgot when is the article of Fides Ecclesiastical. When did he write that one? Somebody has it there? Okay, yeah, it's for like 4 years before. All right, so I guess he hasn't, at that point when he wrote that, he did not research the question of Fides Ecclesiastica yet, I suppose. Yes?
He does say usually designated.
Usually, that's right. He says usually, that's right. So he does not necessarily endorse that, but he says usually. All right. So here he repeats the definition of Vatican I, and on the next page, commenting on that, he says, it is evident that in those encyclical letters which are addressed to all the ordinaries of the Catholic Church throughout the world, the Holy Father is exercising his function as pastor and teacher of all Christians. He exercises that same function also when he issues a pronouncement directly to some individual or to some portion of the church, ultimately, however, directing it to and intending it as normative for the entire church militant. So the examples of that, I already given that to you. Notre Charge Apostolique is a very well-known encyclical of Saint Pius X, directed to the French bishops, but obviously has a very important teachings for the entire church. And in German, there is another one. Mit brennender Sorge, right? Pope Pius XI. So in any case, the point is, when need be, the Pope will, address a question that's particularly relevant in a country or something. But still, it's a teaching. Indirectly, it's still a teaching for the universal church. The allocation to midwives, again, I have given you those examples before, but the allocation to midwives by Pope Pius XII is a very important document for concerning Christian marriage and what you can do and what you can't. So, and Pope Pius XII was just speaking to midwives. He wasn't. It was an allocation. There is no reason whatsoever to suppose that the style of the encyclical letters is in any way incompatible with the possibility of a genuine papal definition, in which the sovereign pontiff, pro suprema sua apostolica auctoritate, so using the expression of Vatican I, defines a teaching on faith or morals as something to be held by the universal church. A definition is an ultimate and irrevocable doctrinal decision. The Ecclesia Doctrines pronounces this decision and intends that no one in the future shall ever contradict it. A defined doctrine is a teaching which cannot be questioned legitimately at any time after the definition is given. When the Holy Father issues a definition, he obviously makes it clear that he is making an irrevocable statement of doctrine. This manifestation comes in solemn form where, as in the case of a definition of Our Lady's Immaculate Conception in the Ineffabilis Deus, or in the decision on Anglican orders in the Apostolicae Curae, a consecrated set of terms is employed. But there can obviously be a genuine definition even apart from this solemn form of pronouncement. So when they say, we decree, define, and judge, and decide, all of these things, to make sure really you get the point, that this. All right, so then it's very clear. But sometimes they won't necessarily use all of those terms, and still it is very clear that they are deciding an issue. Where a question of grave moment has been disputed among Catholics and where the Holy Father intervenes to settle this question once and for all, there is clearly a definition, a decision which all Catholics are bound to accept always as true, even though no solemn terminology be employed. In his extremely interesting work in Hérésie Fantôme, l'Américanisme, the Abbé Félix Klein, quotes a passage from a letter written by the late Cardinal Richard to the priest of his archdiocese. In this letter, the Cardinal Archbishop of Paris shows that he considered the letter Testem Benevolentiae a real definition, despite the fact that this letter does not contain any solemn form of pronouncement. So here you have the quote here. At the end, it says, dans laquelle, in which letter, il définissait les divers points traités dans ces discussions et exposait la doctrine à laquelle les fidèles devaient rester attachés. There you go. Did you get that? He says, in which he was defining the diverse points treated in those discussions and was exposing the doctrine to which the faithful must stay attached, or must hold, I would say. So in any case, he considered Testem Benevolentiae, the Archbishop of Paris, considered Testem Benevolentiae, which is a letter, apostolic letter, if I'm not mistaken, of Leo XIII to Cardinal Gibbons, actually. So again, it was meant to him, but indirectly it was a teaching for the entire church against Americanism, which is a precursor of modernism, basically. And he considered that to be infallible. We saw, if I'm not mistaken, that Schultz also does. And so he's not the only one. So let me see now. He after that makes an allusion to all the documents on church and state and others. All right, we don't need to go through all of this. Number 216, this one is interesting. There is furthermore still another way in which the Holy Father, speaking directly to an individual local church, can still be said to present teaching normative for the entire church. This comes about when he exercises his function as the authorized teacher of the Roman Church itself, that is, the Church of Rome, as in the Diocese of Rome. We will speak about more about that when we speak about the Roman Pontiff. He actually wrote an article on that, which is very interesting. But in any case, let's continue here. From the earliest Christian times, the Ecclesia Romana, considered precisely as an individual congregation within the universal kingdom of God on earth, has rightly been considered as infallible in its doctrine. And if you recall, the table reading, we had that a few days ago for the lunch table reading that Tobias was reading on St. Peter. And so he was saying that its teaching and its belief were correctly considered as normative for the universal church militant. So here I will skip what he says, but in another article we'll see that in greater detail when we speak about the Roman Pontiff. But basically, what Monsignor Fenton defends, and I think he's right, is that the Roman Church is a little bit like a microcosm of the entire universal church. So, this is, let's say, the church here, and here is Rome. So the Diocese of Rome. So the properties of the universal church will be found in the Church of Rome, as in the diocese. So infallibility, indefectibility, and so forth and so on. He applies that, basically. He says it always has to be there. And actually, if you look in the Denzinger, there is something like the Church of Rome will lose the faith, it's condemned, bam. It's a heresy. It's actually Luther would say that. So it's anyway, it's a good point, because that means it's impossible that all of Rome, for example, would just lose the faith. So, I mean, it raises very interesting questions in our situation, in the sense, if you say, for example, we are maintaining the faith and so forth and so on, all right, but it's impossible that in Rome, for example, there is nothing. So again, it's a question, here's just my opinion now, disclaimer. But in the context of the debate between totalism and the physicists, for example, if you say that Novus Ordo Church is a sect and blah, 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 if there is nothing left in Rome, you have a huge problem. That's impossible. It's just impossible. It belongs to, according to Monsignor Fenton and the Denzinger and other places, it's impossible that there would be nothing left in Rome. So, it's just end of private discussion. Yes, Frank. Yes, right. Well, I guess the same as for the universal church. That okay, you might say, well, okay, maybe we don't have authority, but it doesn't mean everybody is a non-Catholic and so forth and so on. But if you say everybody is a non-Catholic and there's nobody left there, you have a big problem. Yes, Eden. Well, yes and no, in the sense that I would, for example, it would be very rash to just say that everybody in Rome is a heretic. No, forget it. A lot of people are still in good faith, and they might be in Novus Ordo, and they are Catholics, you know. So it's difficult. You can make a case by case judgment. Okay, this one definitely he knows that whatever religious liberty is wrong and this and that, and he's very happy with it. All right, then I guess he's pertinacious. But for a lot of people, they just want to go to church. That's all. They're very simple people. Yes.
And that would be because this includes the faithful and the hierarchy.
If we speak about passive infallibility, yes, and the indefectibility, as much as you need the church. So it includes the side of the people, but also the question of the apostolicity, obviously. So that's another question, but there has to be at least some material succession. So anyway, I think it's an important point actually against totalism, in the sense that you have to find a way somehow that you still have apostolicity in Rome. It's not just we have totalist bishops in the world, that doesn't solve the question of Rome. Plus, it doesn't work even. But so obviously, they never address that question at all. So, but as I said, it's just my 20 cents or 2 cents, whatever you say on that. End of the private discussion on that. But it's, I think it's an interesting question. In any case, so basically, when he teaches the Diocese of Rome, the Pope is infallible. That's the point he is making here. Taking care of the Diocese of Rome. Okay, after that he explains that when the Pope alone is imposing a teaching on the Universal Church, obviously it does the same as when all the bishops with him do it. So when you have the entire Ecclesia Doctrines, I don't think that's really controverted. But basically, the question he addresses that because some theologians actually did not even address the question of the ordinary magisterium of the Pope. So they would say, okay, the Church is infallible in councils, ecumenical councils, all the bishops and the Pope together in the entire world. The Pope, when he makes solemn judgments, like he defines a dogma, but they would not even speak about what about the Pope when he's just teaching, like giving an encyclical to the Church. Some theologians did not even address that in the past. Again, you have to think that the encyclicals is a new thing. In a sense, it's recent, right? Leo XIII is really the one who made it the favorite way of teaching for the Pope. So in the past, when you would hear about the Pope of Rome, it would many times be precisely for that, for a definition or some very serious thing. So which is why they would not speak about an ordinary teaching of the Pope, because the communication wasn't that great at the time. Now today, the Pope can speak and the entire world knows what he says. Well, I mean today, well, you need a Pope, but you understand the point, right? It's a lot easier now to communicate that one bishop can speak to the entire world, the Bishop of Rome. All right, let's move on. In page 218, we have a number of important passages here. So in such a case, page 218, he speaks about what is the point of being a theologian then. He says, in such a case, the only true doctrinal authority actually operative would be that of the individual theologian. The Holy Father has issued his encyclical as a series of statements, apart from those which he himself stamps as manifestly merely opinative. All of these statements stand as the Holy Father's own declarations. The man who subjects these declarations to an analysis in order to distinguish the element of Catholic tradition from other sections of the content must employ some norm other than the authority of the Holy Father himself. So the role of a theologian is, again, to popularize, let's say, the papal encyclicals, to differentiate what is now absolutely certain, what is left to opinion, and things like that. The Holy Father's authority stands behind his own individual statements, precisely as these are found in the encyclicals. When a private theologian ventures to analyze these statements and claims to find a Catholic principle on which the Holy Father's utterance is based, and some contingent mode according to which the Sovereign Pontiff has applied this Catholic principle in his own pronouncement, the only effective doctrinal authority is that of the private theologian himself. So here he's blasting people who would relativize what the Holy Father says because, he's imbued with modern philosophy, so this is why he says this, but it's actually not wrong, but the Catholic principle is this, and blah, blah, blah. So then the rule of faith is not the Pope anymore, it's the theologian. So that's an abuse, obviously. So you can use that against mente vacantism and things like that. According to this method of procedure, the Catholic people would be expected to accept as much of the encyclical as the theologian pronounced to be genuine Catholic teaching. So you sift, and all right, so here you have Catholic doctrine, and there state all of the private opinions of the Roman Pontiff as a private doctor. That's not how it works. If it's in an encyclical, it's his public office of teaching. This Catholic teaching would be recognizable as such not by reason of the Holy Father's statement in the encyclical, but by reason of its inclusion in other monuments of Christian doctrine. So again, it's very clearly anti-SSPX, where you would just sift, like, okay, does that fit? It's like a sift where you have the, the triangle and the square and the round that when you are a baby you have, and you put a triangle and a triangle and things like that. So if it fits something that already was taught, like, all right, this is Catholic teaching. If it doesn't, then it's not. That's not how it works, because then the Pope would, the only thing he could say basically is repeat what was already taught. Like, he cannot, make any new pronouncement or something. It doesn't make any sense. What's the point of him teaching otherwise? Yeah, you don't. I'm sure you had that. You have like the round, and you have this and this, and you have to make it fit. Right? So you take Amoris Laetitia, and then oh, there is one little piece that fits what Papa XII said. So bloop, that gets through. Everything else is still on top. Well, at least it's honest. At least they would say, okay, this doesn't fit, because you have some people who like, it would be like, I don't know, they have something like that, and you're like, no, it doesn't fit. They're like, yes, it does. No, it doesn't. Yes, it does, and it doesn't. So at least they have this honesty, at least to say, well, this doesn't fit. Anyway, it is very difficult to see where such a process would stop. Well, I know where it stops. It stops in Menzingen. The men who would adopt this course would inevitably force themselves to treat all the doctrinal pronouncements of the popes after the fashion of the teachings of private theologians. So again, if you take any book here, obviously you don't take it as gospel. You're like, okay, well, I guess who says this? Cajetan says this, whatever. Palmieri says this, but it's him saying it. So who says it? Bergoglio? I don't care about it. No, you can't do it. The writings of earlier pontiffs are certainly no more authoritative than those of the more recent sovereign pontiffs. Well, this was written before Vatican II, but you should be able to apply the same rules to Bergoglio, Ratzinger, and the rest of them than you did for Pope Pius XII and Pope Pius XI and so forth and so on. So in any case here, he was already basically complaining that some people would take any pronouncement from, St. Pius V as basically definitive and a norm, a rule of faith, and that they would just reject encyclicals because, well, I guess it's recent. So there is something about it's a spirit actually that you will find even among some lay people too. They will always quote theologians from the past as the reference and this and that, and they won't trust any clergy whatsoever. Which to me it doesn't make any sense, because a theologian, what is it? Somebody who wrote a book. And yes, he's learned in theology, but he wrote a book, and because it's in a book and it's old, for some reason, like, this is it. And if you say it and you are alive, then it's not it. It's like, why? Like, what's the difference, If I write a book and die, and then it becomes a dogma, and if I am alive, then it's wrong. It's like, it doesn't make any sense. Because those were men also, and sometimes, okay, you have great theologians who have a big authority, but sometimes it would just be like a priest who knew some theology, but he probably doesn't know more than Bishop Sanborn, or and just because it's a book and it's written, and then we can quote it because he's not there to say you're wrong. So that's convenient. So in any case, I don't know where this spirit is coming from. But some people will do that with the Pope. If it's from the past and it's written down and it's in a book, then okay, we accept it. If it's a new document that just came out from a living Roman pontiff, then be careful. Why? It doesn't make any sense. So anyway. Let's move on. If a man chooses to dissect the encyclicals of Pope Leo XIII, there is no reason why the documents which emanate from Gelasius or from Saint Leo I should not be subjected to exactly the same process. If the statements of Pope Pius IX are not valid exactly as they stand, it is difficult to see how those of any other Roman pontiff are any more authoritative. There is, of course, a definite task incumbent upon the private theologian in the Church's process of bringing the teachings of the papal encyclicals to the people. The private theologian is obligated and privileged to study these documents to arrive at an understanding of what the Holy Father actually teaches, and then to aid in the task of bringing this body of truth to the people. The Holy Father, however, not the private theologian, remains the doctrinal authority. The theologian is expected to bring out the content of the Pope's actual teaching, not to subject that teaching to the type of criticism he would have a right to impose on the writings of another private theologian. So this is a beautiful page. You can keep it aside. Two paragraphs below, just because he speaks about Cardinal Newman, and I like to, when I can, just shoot a little bit there. Unfortunately, the tendency to misinterpret the function of the private theologian in the Church's doctrinal work is not something now, should be new, I think, in English Catholic literature. Cardinal Newman, in his letter to the Duke of Norfolk, certainly the least valuable of his published works, I'm not saying it, Monsignor Fenton is speaking, supports the bizarre thesis, that's not the same, that the final determination of what is really condemned in an authentic ecclesiastical pronouncement is the work of private theologians, rather than of the particular organ of the Ecclesia Doctrines, which has actually formulated the condemnation. So that's very odd, to say the least. The faithful could, according to his theory, find what a pontifical document actually means, not from the content of a document itself, but from the speculations of the theologians. In any case, I don't know why, but some people on our side actually refer to Cardinal Newman as if he were like a doctor of the church or something. It's something I never understood because, I mean, if you know a little bit about the controversy between Cardinal Manning, who was very good, and Cardinal Newman, you would not be a big fan of Cardinal Newman, believe me. If you do, I hope you study the Nova Theologia, the new theology, you will see Cardinal Newman had some very progressive ideas on certain things. So he's not a reference in doctrine as far as I'm concerned at all. All right, so just the last paragraph of this article will be enough to conclude here. This tendency to consider the pronouncements of the Ecclesia Doctrines, and particularly the statements of the papal encyclicals, as utterances which must be interpreted for the Christian people rather than explained to them, is definitely harmful to the Church. It is, and it remains, the business of Catholic theologians to adhere faithfully to the teachings of the encyclicals and to do all in their power to bring this body of truth accurately and effectively to the members of Christ's mystical body. So it's very clear here. So the work of theologians is to comment, to explain, but not to diminish and to destroy the authority, basically, of an encyclical. Okay. So now we can move on. We have 20 minutes left. We'll have a look at this article. I'm sorry, it's a lot of articles, maybe a little bit tedious, but that will be the end of the Magisterium class. So this article, we won't be able to read all of it, obviously, together, and I don't want to because it's more of the same. But it's from another author, so you can see that there is some common agreement on those things. So, the doctrinal value of the ordinary teaching of the Holy Father in view of the Humani Generis. So he's commenting on that part of the Humani Generis where Pope Pius XII basically says, if I say something, if the Pope says something in the encyclical, decides a case, that's it, you cannot discuss it anymore. So see in the top of the page here, where it is taken from, Proceedings of the 6th Annual Convention of the Catholic Theological Society of America. We should revive that. I mean, I think it still exists in Novus Ordo, but in any case, there were some theological conventions, and I just wish I could go. So in 1951. So basically, they would discuss different subjects. So here, it's basically somebody explaining that question, and at the end of the article, the last 3 or 4 pages, you can see other priests intervening basically and saying, well, okay, he's right, but, or he's wrong because whatever. So it's actually interesting if there was like a discussion about what he says. But this is from Father Edmond Bernard, so from the Catholic University of America. So we'll read the beginning, and when the bell rings, then that will be it, and you can look at the rest together, on your own. But anyway, the beginning is the most important part, actually, because that's where he explains the confusion that exists because theologians do not employ the same terms and expressions. So, in the Nouvelle Revue Théologique last fall, Father Jean Levy, I suppose, a Jesuit, wrote, quote, "The encyclical letter Humani Generis comes to us as an illuminating work destined to dispel a confusion which was tending to increase and which, in the present situation, could have become extremely harmful. From us, it calls for that complete intellectual docility which seeks to understand fully in order to obey perfectly." End quote. So again, you had that tendency, and he noticed that himself, Father Levy, that that tendency of, it's not infallible, therefore I don't care, or it's infallible, oh yes, then I should agree, but if it's not infallible, I don't care, which obviously is very prevalent today as well. I have been asked to discuss the doctrinal value of the ordinary teaching of the Holy Father in view of the Humani Generis, so this is now Father Bernard speaking. As a preliminary, however, some few words must be said about the ordinary teaching authority itself. While I do not believe that there is any real disagreement among Catholic theologians about the substance of their teaching on the Ordinary Magisterium, there definitely is a difference in the terminology employed. I told you that many times. A difference that creates a difficulty in teaching the matter to theological students, so now I can cry, and might possibly be the cause of some confusion. Do we say, for instance, with Dublanchy, that the Pope can be infallible by virtue of his ordinary magisterium? So he refers to the DTC here. Or do we, with Dickman, make equivalent terms of ordinary magisterium and non-infallible magisterium? Do we say with Billot that the Pope can speak infallibly without speaking ex cathedra? To me, that's the most confusing ever. Or do we say with Zappelena, Dick-Camp and others regard an infallible pronouncement as inevitably also an ex cathedra one? So those theologians who are listed in the footnote here basically equate ex cathedra and infallible, which I think makes more sense. So you can see here you have Zappelena, Dick-Camp, D'Herbigny, Schultz, Pech, Benvel, but there are definitely more than that. Are we to say that an infallible pronouncement is necessarily an ex cathedra pronouncement, or that it is not? In what terms can we best express the reality involved? These, I submit, are questions that should be examined before we can discuss without nominal ambiguity the ordinary magisterium of the Pope. So we're trying to avoid ambiguity. So here he will quote the Vatican Council. I won't quote it again. Then he moves on. The definition of the Council must, of course, be the foundation for any treatment of the Catholic teaching on the infallibility of the Roman Pontiff. It must not be minimized, nor must it be exaggerated. The Council's words are clear, and they must be understood as meaning what they say, neither more nor less. It is a divinely revealed dogma, according to the conciliar definition, that the Roman Pontiff speaks infallibly when he speaks ex cathedra, and then the Council explains also just what it means by this cum ex cathedra loquito. It goes on to say, id est, that is, when, first, in performance of his office as pastor and teacher of all Christians, so he's addressing the church, not as a private theologian, but as the Pope. Second, in the supreme exercise of his apostolic authority. Third, he defines a doctrine of faith and morals, so it's not about science precisely. Fourth, to be held by the universal church. Clearly then, as far as the Vatican definition goes, to say that the Pope speaks infallibly and to say that he speaks ex cathedra are two ways of describing the same concrete act. They both mean that he has fulfilled the description given in the four conditions outlined in the definition. The fulfillment of the conditions equals an ex cathedra pronouncement equals an infallible pronouncement. What? The fulfillment of the conditions equals. Does it make sense in English? The fulfillment of the conditions equals an ex cathedra pronouncement equals an infallible pronouncement. Well, I guess you can make equals everywhere. Basically, it's the same. If you have the condition, it's ex cathedra, and if it is ex cathedra, then it is infallible. This is just as true read backwards. An infallible pronouncement equals an ex cathedra pronouncement equals the fulfillment of the four conditions. So for him, it's the same, and that makes sense. Or in any sequential arrangement that can be made of the three elements. In the language of logic, we would say that the council's definition gives the same extension to ex cathedra that it gives to infallible. So again, we can do the drawing thing. Okay, so if we were to say, which is the one he took first? Ex cathedra. Okay, so if orange is ex cathedra, don't say that, for example, yellow is infallible. That doesn't make sense. Infallible would be the same as the orange, right? So, okay, do you understand? That's extension. Just a review. Everybody has done logic or not? Who did not do? No, you didn't. Okay. So in any case, extension means on how many inferiors it extends, it covers. So what it includes. So the best way to present it is drawing like that. So it means it covers the same. It contains the same. You understand? So basically, everything that will be in the ex cathedra category will also be in the infallible category. All right. Through whatever vehicle of dissemination he employs, when the sovereign pontiff speaks infallibly, he speaks ex cathedra. So whether it be an encyclical, a bull, anything, a letter, it doesn't matter. Does this mean, next page, that the Pope in his ordinary magisterium is not infallible? So there we go again to this dispute. In answer to this question, we must be very careful of our terminology and understand well the reality underlying our words. The Vatican Council defined that the Holy Father enjoys the same infallibility in defining doctrines concerning faith and morals that the Church possesses. All right, so then he gives the quote. Now, the Ecclesia Doctrines, which is to say the residential bishops of a church, in union and agreement with and in subordination to the visible head of a church, teaches infallibly either in what is called the solemn or extraordinary magisterium, when the bishops are governed in ecumenical council, or in what is called the ordinary magisterium, when the bishops are dispersed in their several dioceses in agreement and in moral union among themselves and with the Holy Father. Since the Church is infallible both in its extraordinary and in its ordinary magisterium, and the Pope, in the words of the Council, enjoys the same infallibility that the Church possesses, should we not say that the Pope is infallible both in his extraordinary and in his ordinary magisterium? The question is clear, but the answer will depend on what we mean by the ordinary magisterium. So I have told you already that for the bishops, extraordinary and ordinary refer to the mode. Usually most theologians will take it as a reference to the mode, that is how they do it. So extraordinary, they are all gathered in an ecumenical council. Ordinary, they are dispersed throughout the earth. They are teaching in union with the bishop and submitted to the bishop. So they can truly have infallible teaching through the universal ordinary magisterium. All right? So that the question is, okay, so if the Pope has the same infallibility as the Church, then it would mean that he's infallible when there is solemn or extraordinary teaching, but also ordinary. Is that right? The problem is they don't use those terms in the same sense. So this is what he is going to say here. First of all, let us not get away from the conciliar definition. The Vatican Council does indeed attribute to the Pope the same infallibility that pertains to the Church, but it governs that attribution by the clause cum ex cathedra loquitur. In other words, the Pope, when he speaks ex cathedra, and only when he speaks ex cathedra, is infallible as the Church is infallible. If we are to say then that the Pope is infallible in his ordinary magisterium, we must provide for an ex cathedra mode of pronouncement within what we mean by the ordinary magisterium. So that's a very good point. So that means if you were to use the same, say, okay, then he must be infallible in both his ordinary and extraordinary magisterium. In any case, it has to be ex cathedra. So remember Biot that used the distinction that it would be infallible but not ex cathedra. according to this priest, it doesn't make sense, and I agree with him. Incidentally, and I do not, of course, present this as an apodictical argument, but merely in the interest of a broader view on the question, from the relaciones made to the fathers to the council by the reporter of the commission that prepared the text of a definition for approval in general session, we learned that the Pope's infallibility was characterized as the same as the churches, not with the thought of drawing a parallel between the extraordinary and ordinary magisteria of a church and the extraordinary and ordinary magisteria of the Pope, but with another purpose in view, which is the one of the second object of infallibility. So the definition was phrased as it is by those who wrote it in order that it might be clear that the Pope's infallibility was to be defined as having the same theological notation as the churches regarding the primary and secondary objects of infallibility. So from the context, if you look at the discussions that they had in the council, when it says that the infallibility of the Pope is the same as that of the Church, the goal is not to equate the distinction ordinary magisterium with the one of the Pope. No. The reason why they phrased it that way was to say, because, again, it is infallible that the Church is infallible in the primary object, but remember that there is a discussion as to whether the fact that the Church is infallible in the secondary object is only theologically certain or actually belonging to the faith. And the council did not want to pronounce on that, so they phrased the definition of papal infallibility in such a way that they would extend that to the Pope without precising what was disputed. Did you get that, or did I lose you there? Truth, you look confused. Right, it's the same thing again. Sorry, I'm just repeating myself. So it's the same thing. So, but basically, he's basically saying that that part of the Vatican Council does not help us in regard to speaking about ordinary or extraordinary magisterium of the Pope, to say whether or not ordinary magisterium is infallible or not, basically. Okay, because that quote is in another context, speaking about something else. Okay. So what is meant by the ordinary magisterium? Well, we can consider it, of course, as Dickman does, precisely as that teaching of the Holy Father, which is not infallible. This has the advantage of simplicity and clarity, but it runs into a difficulty. For when we enumerate, once again, as Dickman does, following Marotto, who is a canonist, such organs or vehicles of the ordinary magisterium as constitutions, the motu proprio, apostolic letters, encyclicals, instructions, and so forth, we are immediately struck by the fact that at least some of them can be and have been the chosen modes of promulgating infallible pronouncements. All right? So I told you that Pascendi, Testem Benevolentiae were recognized as infallible pronouncements. So if you classify encyclicals as ordinary magisterium and you say ordinary magisterium is not infallible, then you have some problem. Can we say that the Holy Father's solemn or extraordinary magisterium implies a doctrinal definition and that the ordinary magisterium implies a presentation, an explanation, an authoritative exposition of Catholic doctrine, but not a definition? Provided we employ a rigidly delimited sense of the word definition, this terminology cannot be called incorrect. But we must realize that in a broad sense, definition may be applied to any doctrinal decision of the Holy See. And the Holy Father, every time he makes a decision on doctrinal matters, certainly does not call upon the supreme exercise of his apostolic authority. It is true, however, that in the strict sense in which the word definite is obviously used in the Vatican Council text under discussion, it is a condition of an ex cathedra pronouncement and hence inextricably and inseparably bound up with one. I submit for the consideration of the members of this society, so the convention to which he was speaking, that it is in the term ex cathedra, to which we constantly return in any treatment of papal infallibility, that we find the key to a consistent and accurate terminology with regard to the extraordinary and ordinary magisteria of a sovereign pontiff. Might we not say the following three things? So here is what he proposes. First, the Pope employs his extraordinary magisterium when he speaks ex cathedra. So he will classify something which is extraordinary is ex cathedra. This extraordinary magisterium is de se by itself, always and necessarily infallible. So here he quotes Franzelin, he quotes Bishop Gasser, who was speaking for the Commission for the Faith, if I'm not mistaken. All right. Second, the Pope employs his ordinary magisterium when he speaks to the faithful, indeed as their supreme pastor and teacher, but in order to expound, explain, present Catholic teaching, or to admonish, persuade, enlighten, warn, and encourage the faithful, without calling upon the supreme exercise of his apostolic authority, and without, in a strict sense, defining a doctrine. In this case, he does not speak ex cathedra, and the ordinary magisterium is hence not de se infallible. So basically, Father Bernard here is equating ex cathedra, infallible, and extraordinary. So obviously that is not what Biot did, right? But it's what is commonly done. So for him, extraordinary, when we speak about the Pope, means the same as infallible, means the same as ex cathedra. That's the way he takes it, and that's the way a lot of theologians take it. 3. However, the Pope may, if he chooses, employ a usual organ or vehicle of the ordinary magisterium as the medium of an ex cathedra pronouncement. In this case, an encyclical letter, for example, certainly a type of document usually associated with the ordinary magisterium, may be used as the vehicle of the extraordinary magisterium. So the distinction between extraordinary and ordinary for the Pope is taken as a distinction of degree of authority and degree, therefore, of infallibility. Okay? It's not taken as a mode, as in the case for the bishops. Here, it's taken as a question of degree, how binding it is. If it is definitive and blah, 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 then it's extraordinary, infallible, ex cathedra. But if it is not, if it's just simply authentic, then it is ordinary. Okay? Do you get that? All right. Do you have any question on that? Because we are actually getting to the end, and that's the main point I really wanted to insist on. Because again, when you do some theology, and you will read different theologians, and you might be very confused with what we say if you're not aware of that. If you're not aware that they use different terms, that they don't even agree on how to express the infallibility of the Pope in his ordinary or authentic teaching, and so forth and so on. So. I encourage you to finish reading this article, but you can do that on your own. He refers to Dublanchy and Biot, which we have seen, would say that there are some places where it's not infallible, but it's ex cathedra, which is very confusing, so forth and so on. So then he speaks about the assent again and again, but we already did all of that. But it gives you another theologian who basically says the same. So I think it shows that there is some, agreement on that. All right. So.